This is Echo 3, and let's discuss tourist contracts. If you play in career mode, funds are an important resource that you need to manage, and tourist contracts tend to pay pretty well. I would like to continue upgrading the facilities of the Kerbal Space Center, but I am in need of more funds. The tourist contracts, in my opinion, tend to be easier to manage earlier in career mode. Our contract involves only 3 tourists and does not require us to leave Kerbin's sphere of influence. We only have the 1 contract available, but if possible, I like to take on 2 or 3 contracts at once. Another nice thing about this particular contract is we do not have to land on any of Kerbin's moons, so we only need to design an orbital craft. As we design our craft, we need to keep our mission parameters in mind. We need room for our 3 tourists and a pilot. I'm using a 5 Kerbal design to help level up my Kerbals. We need to be able to get into orbit around Kerbin. Now we need to work backwards, so that means we need about 200 meters per second to go from Minmus to Kerbin, 150 meters per second to get into orbit around Minmus, about 300 meters per second to go from the Mun to Minmus, about 100 meters per second to get into an elliptical orbit around the Mun, about 850 meters per second to transfer to the Mun, and about 3,400 meters per second to get into low Kerbin orbit. That means after reaching orbit, we want to have a minimum of 1,600 meters per second of delta V left for the mission. If you've seen my other career mode tutorials, you will know that I like to collect as much science as possible. We have not yet used the magnetometer around Mun or Minimus yet. I figured that since the tourists are paying for this contract, we may as well get some free science points out of the mission. You may have noticed too that I got rid of most of the ablator. This is a default career mode, so re-enter heating is not very bad. And lastly, you may have noticed I offset the solar panels to counteract the weight of the magnetometer. The mainsail engine is a little more powerful than we need, but the skipper engine was a little too weak. This ends up giving us a higher thrust to weight than I consider ideal. Ultimately though, the gravity turn is not as efficient as I typically prefer, but we are left in a low orbit with far more delta V than we'll ultimately need for the mission. As I set up our maneuver node here to get into orbit, I can see that we're going to have way more than 1,600 meters per second of delta V for the rest of this mission. So I know we're in good shape. Once we get into low Kerbin orbit, we'll need to think about our maneuver out to the Mun. So I'll set the Mun as our target and pull out the maneuver node about 850 meters per second and set up the encounter. I play around with the maneuver node a little more than I need to, but I like to set up an efficient encounter. Okay, and we burn our way out to the Mun and set up our orbit. Now we only need to get into orbit. We don't actually have to get into a low circular orbit. The contract only stipulates orbit, so that's all I'm going to do. Once we get into orbit here, I'm going to use the magnetometer. Hey, tourists are paying for the contract, so I might as well do it. We'll do it in low orbit and in high orbit. There we go. And we've done all the science we need from the Mun. We will set Minmus as our target. Now, ideally, Minmus is 90 degrees ahead of Kerbin when we set up this maneuver. And ultimately, it took me about 5 minutes to set up this maneuver, so I cut out a lot of that for you guys. Due to our elliptical orbit, I was not able to set up an ideal transfer window because it just took so long around the orbital path. Ultimately, this is what I'm ended up with, and with a small mid-course correction, we're going to end up in Minmus orbit really without too much difficulties. You know, we're dealing with such low velocities here in the Kerbin system that we were not going to have any problems with this. And you can see I have to swing really wide to end up catching Minmus on our second intersect of its orbit. Again, we have way more delta V for our mission than we need, so I don't really worry about it. And we are able to do the magnetometer here around Minmus, setting up ourselves into low orbit. This will make our transfer back to Kerbin just a little easier. But science in low orbit, science in high orbit, and let's set up our return back to Kerbin. We just need to burn retrograde to Minmus's orbit, and that'll set us up into Kerbin's atmosphere. Ideally, I'm shooting for around 35 kilometers in altitude. You know, don't go too deep. Don't go down to like 20 or 15. Should be all right. I got rid of most of the ablator, but still, this craft is going to be in way better shape than it even needs to be. I'm going to pull up the mod trajectories. I want to see exactly where we're going to land. I can see that we're not actually going to land on the first pass. So I burn retrograde to set up a landing encounter here. We enjoy the plasma show. We'll deploy the chutes, and we'll land safely without any ablator left, but no heat damage. There we go, and we recover. We can see that we got over 500 science points, and beyond that, this little mission netted us over $250,000 funds. That will help us upgrade our R&D buildings and our tracking station. Well, thanks for joining me to discuss capitalism, Taurus contracts. See you next time.